discussion series is going to be for 4 weeks. I'm going to do talking for 3 weeks, sharing the idea we're discussing, and then week 4 we're going to have a guest speaker, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy this series. It's called Stand, and then I put like this really long subtitle with it, Understanding Whose You Are in a World Trying to Define Who You Are. So today, when you walked in, we did something new. I asked you to hello, my name is, and put your name, and then a descriptor, 1 or 2 word descriptor of yourself. I think it's interesting to look around and see how people describe and identify, maybe define themselves, right? And this is something that, growing up and maybe in your life and in your world, you had people in your life that were constantly trying to define who you were, right? Maybe you've spent your life trying to find that label that fits just right, trying to find that identity that is truly you. And at some level, all of those descriptors that maybe you give yourself, or maybe you gave it to yourself because someone else gave it to you, like you just like redeemed it. I'll give you an example. When I was in middle school, and I was on this like retreat with like our school and then like our youth group all at the same time. And I was about to be beat up by some older guys who weren't fond of me. Maybe you understand what that's like. And so some guys that were older than them, they always picked on me. But I decided in a survival mode that I would be friends with these guys. And they had a moniker, they had a nickname for me. It was Meatloaf. Now, as a chubby middle schooler, a name, a moniker like Meatloaf, a label like Meatloaf can be something that can be just devastating, right, to a middle schooler. But for me, it meant these guys were accepting me, and honestly, with that came some protection. And guess what? Yes, it was Meatloaf, but the pretty senior cheerleaders at our school, they knew who Meatloaf was, right? And so we sometimes even redeem those things that we don't want, we don't like. They didn't come from necessarily a good place, but we tend to redeem those. And as we grow, as we mature, even into adulthood, I think all of us are trying to find a label that fits. Maybe you label yourself by your career. Maybe you label yourself by some other kind of relationship, so-and-so's family member, so-and-so's husband, wife, spouse, partner, so-and-so's somebody, right? You identify yourself by them. Maybe it's by a distinguishing characteristic that everyone can see, or maybe one of those invisible characteristics that no one can see. Either way, we tend to put labels on other people. We tend to have labels put on us. We tend to give our own selves labels. But when we label ourselves and allow others to do the same, we begin to act only in the best interest of that label or identity. Have you felt that? This is something that I believe politicians in our country use all the time. They want to pigeonhole people by categories and labels. People in power tend to do that as a way to maintain power. Because if I can get you to act in the best interests of this specific identity that does not encapsulate you as a whole, but is this very specific thing about you, I can control, I can manipulate. And I think people in power have been doing that for as long as power and authority has been around. But most labels we give ourselves, or we allow others to give us, are too small. They hold us back and they limit our influence. So as we go throughout this series, I want us to understand one thing about who we really are. Being able to get to that deepest rooted identity. Richard Rohr says it this way in his book, The Universal Christ. You are not your gender, your nationality, your ethnicity, your skin color, or your social class. You are a child of God and always will be, even when you don't believe it. Now, there's people here all the time that join the discussion that do not believe in God. And we say, we are so glad you're here, right? We welcome that in. And so I'm going to kind of give a perspective that's certainly going to be rooted in this identity of whose we are, rooted in God. And you may not believe that, and that's okay. That's why we want you to discuss at the table. We want you to share your thoughts and your ideas on this as well. But as we move through this series, I want us to look at whose we are, because understanding whose we are in a world trying to define who we are can be beneficial to us. But there's a running theme when you look at the Jewish scriptures. Some people call it the Old Testament. If you have a Bible in here today, or grab one from the back, it's kind of like the front 2/3 of the Bible. There's a running theme in that and into the New Testament that is this: standing up as a child of God, dedicated to the law of God, puts you at odds with the world. Standing up as a child of God, dedicated to the law of God, puts you at odds with the world. Now, I want to define a few things so that we're clear on what I mean when I say this, because I know when I say some of these words, some of them are loaded, right? They're loaded with history and baggage and all the things that you have going on. So I want to help. First off, this idea of child of God. Okay, that's that rooted identity in this, that God is our source. God as source. The idea that everything that exists out of God. This is offspring. That mindset. In the New Testament, one of the writers, Paul, he uses this phrase that kind of means the same thing, but it has a little bit different twist on it. It's in Christ. In Christ. It was this identity that he gave to these people at the church, and he was telling them, like, listen, as he wrote to these churches and his friends and these places, these churches that he had started, he said, listen, he would correct behavior. He would talk about all the things that were going on, and in some of these churches, some of the craziest things were going on, but he always identified them as in Christ, the idea that they were a child of God. This was their deepest rooted identity. And then there's this idea of law of God, right? And that turns us off, right? Because you look at maybe the Bible to you was a rule book. Maybe the Bible to you was this list of do's and don'ts. It was these regulations that you couldn't keep up with, and you were done trying at some point. That's not what I mean when I talk about the law of God. You see, when Jesus came onto the scene, he took these 630 plus laws that the Jewish people had, and he summed them up into two things and then into one thing. So when he's asked at one point, what's the greatest? He said, listen, to love God with your whole self and to love your neighbor as yourself. And then someone was like, well, who's your neighbor? And then he tells this story where he makes the hated in that culture the hero and goes, oh, everyone's my neighbor. And then before he died, he's having these like heart-to-hearts with his closest followers, and he says this, he summed all of the law, all of the prophets, everything can be summed up in this: love each other. So when I say the law of God, what I'm talking about is this law of love. To love God with your whole self, to love your neighbor as yourself, to ultimately love each other. So when you stand up as a child of God, I'm rooted in this. I am made in the image of the divine. And so I am going to love like Jesus did, because he was the divine. It puts you at odds with the world. And I don't mean this. I don't mean people are just automatically going to hate you. Like sometimes that's the thing. Like if I can have this victim mindset as a Christian, then that makes it like me like more deeper as a follower of Jesus, right? I'm somehow deeper and better because I've suffered some. No. At odds with the world, I mean the systems of the world, the systems of ego, right? The powers and authorities that are bent on oppressing groups of people. And it's been different groups of people throughout different times in history. But this ego-driven systems of the world, this idea of thinking like everyone else when it comes to things like power and my neighbor and how do I love. Because we tend to, whenever we focus on these very small identities, we tend to love only the people that look like us. And when you try to love everyone, when you try to love your neighbor as yourself, and that means your immigrant neighbor, that means your homosexual neighbor, that means your Muslim neighbor, that means your whatever the other in your mind could be, it means that neighbor, to love them as you love yourself. And that is not easy, and when you do that, you will put yourself at odds with the powers and the systems that are in place. So here's our idea worth discussing today. When you know whose you are, you have a better idea of who you are to be and what you ought to do. When your identity is rooted in this divine relationship, I think we get a better, clearer picture of who we are to be, who we are to become, and what we ought to do in situations where maybe we need to take a stand. So throughout this series, we're going to be looking at a couple different people, a few different people actually. And the first one's going to be, we're going to find the first 3 weeks these stories in the book of Daniel in the Jewish scripture. So we see that Daniel and his friends are taken from where they live, they're taken from their home into another home. And what they did was complete assimilation. They gave them name changes. They castrated these young men so they could not have a line and a legacy. They gave them new stories and a new language. But there was a point where Daniel and his 3 friends draw a line in the sand. They take a stand, and again, I believe based on whose they were, their relationship to God as children of God. So I want to kind of pull some things out of this story real quickly and then jump into discussion. So it says here, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. And a lot of people disagree on exactly why. Was this because it wasn't kosher? Did it go against the laws? Or was this meat first offered to idols in their religious system? And so it would have been deemed unclean according to Daniel's religious system. It says he asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. So Daniel had this sort of favor with the person who was in charge of these young men that were taken from the royal house of Israel and brought into his care. It says, but he responded, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I am afraid the king will have me beheaded. Like, this was a legitimate fear that, listen, if we push back against these orders, I serve a power that he's not a benevolent king, right? He's not going to, there's no mercy, there's no grace being shown here. If you turn out worse than everybody else because I don't feed you the way that this person said so, I'm going to be beheaded. So Daniel has to get creative. It says, Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. Daniel does something here that is incredibly, incredibly creative. And some people there's some names for it in our modern culture. Is third way nonviolent resistance. Third way nonviolent resistance, or nonviolent direct action. It wasn't passive, but it also wasn't aggressive, right? It wasn't violent. I'm not going to return violence for violence. But it also was not passive aggressive, because that's just the worst, right? Right? It was creative action directed at real problems, proposing real solutions, engaging oppression without being oppressive or becoming an oppressor. And it was rooted in his identity of whose he was as a child of God. He had this wisdom to say, I need to get creative with how I handle this situation because I'm drawing a line in the sand. I'm going to take a stand for whose I am, my actual deepest rooted identity. I'd have taken the stand at castration. He chose food laws. A great example of what we're talking about here with third way nonviolent resistance or nonviolent direct action is Martin Luther King. And here's what he said about this in his letters from a Birmingham jail. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such creative tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It's this idea of we're not going to return violence for violence, so we got to get creative. We got to create tension. We've got to do something. We have to take a stand here. And I think knowing how to do that and who you are to be in that moment comes from your identity as a child of God, an identity of someone who's in Christ. Again, whether we believe it or not, that is our deepest rooted identity. Look at how the story continues. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, and I think this is very important, we're going to see this running theme in this series of this training period, this assimilation period of how others want to define us and assimilate us into what makes them most comfortable. It says the chief of staff brought the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. They actually became what we're going to see as governors and what's called satraps, like they're going to be over certain regions, serving directly under the king. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. And I want us to understand this today. An identity rooted in divine relationship redefines every other relationship. They went from oppressor to the oppressed, right? Captor and captive, to this relationship where, listen, they were still a people not in their own land, right? They were still a people that were captured and taken. But they created this new relationship because of who they were and the way they chose to interact and to directly oppose this king, who then ends up, because of the way they did it, elevating them to places of authority within his foreign kingdom to them. It's a wonderful, wonderful lesson in wisdom and how that if we can identify ourselves in our deepest rooted identity, which I would say, which I believe, is that you are a child of God. You bear the image of the divine. And at that level, we begin to know whose we are, and so who we are to be and what we ought to do. Listen, there are injustices that happen in the world, directly in front of our face and sometimes far, far away. And if you want to know how to take a stand, if you want to know how do I combat this, I don't want to see this anymore. I think that wisdom comes from being rooted in our identity in Jesus, in the divine. And I think that we're to love our neighbor, which is incredibly difficult to do. To love our neighbor as ourselves, we need to be rooted in this relationship with God. When you know these things, right, who you are to be and what you ought to do, you can take a stand and you can make a difference.